Welcome back, everyone, to the Get More Smarter podcast, episode 28. We're almost to 50, sort of.
This week, 7 times 4.
Ooh, good math. That's Alan Franklin. I'm Jason Bane. That's why we brought him here. This week on the Get More Smarter podcast, House Majority Leader Alec Garnett joins us once again for yet another exclusive view of the legislature from inside the building.
He's awesome. And, he's really tall.
He is. Tallest legislator ever, maybe.
Maybe ever.
Possibly.
Yeah.
The Iowa caucuses devolve into lunacy. The last gasp of impeachment and federal fundraising numbers open up a big window into 2020. Let's start out with Iowa. As we record right now, it's about noon on Tuesday, February the 4th. The latest news that we've heard is that some results from the Iowa caucus will be made available by 5 o'clock p.m. Eastern time, whatever the hell that means. What's going on here?
It's bedlam. Chaos.
Bedlam.
Dogs and cats living together, mass hysteria. All right. Look, and people are just now trying to do forensic reconstruction of what the hell happened last night. But apparently the Iowa Democratic Party was relying on a phone app that was developed to allow them to both calculate the percentages for all the precinct captains so they could determine which candidates had met the 15% viability threshold. And then also it was, of course, going to tabulate the results of the caucuses and transmit them to party.
Bottom line is caucus math is so complicated that it broke an app.
Yeah, well, caucuses are an archaic, kind of an anachronistic system that really ensures that the party faithful have a big role to play in the nomination of a candidate. And the system completely broke in Iowa last night. And there's no sugarcoating this. It was bad. It was bad for the local Iowa Democrats who should be really embarrassed. It's bad for this contractor who developed the app, and there's an unknown.
They're going to need new license plates too. Don't they have the first in the nation?
No, they're like
license plate?
They're like the new. What was the name of that place? With the Brainiac logo.
I don't know.
Cambridge Analytica.
Oh, right.
They're the new Cambridge Analytica.
I don't know. Wow,
people thought they were.
No, Cambridge. The thing is, Cambridge Analytica was overly competent. Cambridge Analytica got stuff done. These people couldn't do anything.
This is a key distinction.
That's
right. No, this is like the bizarro Superman of Cambridge Analytica. Okay,
did nobody test this? Like,
I don't know.
Did they just? They're like, hey, download this app and we're just going to do it.
Normally, when an app is developed for the private sector commercial market, it's subjected to, rigorous testing to make sure that it actually performs under real world conditions. And, well, spectacular failure, guys. We're going to know who the winner of the Iowa caucus is here in due course.
Eventually.
It's not going to matter in the long term scope of the Democratic primary.
It might not even matter in the short term.
Well, that's right. What it is going to do is thoroughly discredit the caucus process, which is something that we've already abandoned for presidential elections here in Colorado. Still used for smaller races by both parties. And as a matter of fact, everybody's going to be going to caucus for the U.S. Senate primary and other races for the Democrats. And I think Republicans are going to do it too.
They still let them vote?
I guess so. Yeah, but that's going to be early in March. And that kicks off the process leading to not the presidential primary that occurs on Super Tuesday, but the everybody else Democratic primary that's at the end.
I was listening to an expert the other day being interviewed trying to explain the caucus system, and I timed it just for fun. It took about 4 minutes to explain the whole thing. To me, if you can't explain it in 15 seconds or less, you shouldn't be doing it.
That's right. I mean, the whole process is designed, like I say, to give party insiders a disproportionate role in the nomination of candidates or to set up candidates to run in the primary. In Colorado, there's two ways, of course, that you can get on the ballot. You can go through the county and state assembly process, or you can simply petition on with a requisite number of signatures. And then everybody has to answer in the end of the voters in the primary. So
the good news here, I would say, is that we're probably on the road to being done with caucuses in general.
I think so.
Which is probably, well, I wouldn't say probably, I think is good.
Well, I mean, the parties have had an erosion of their power. That's a story we've been talking about here for many years, and arguably the caucus is a continuing symptom of that.
The caucus probably made sense 100 years ago when you traveled by horse and it was hard to get people together and it took days to tabulate votes anyway. At that point, maybe this was probably a decent idea. It's just run its course.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of people who are party loyals who will still argue that this is better than, a paid petition drive where anybody with enough money can buy their way onto the ballot. There's no easy answer for this, but I'll tell you that Iowa has really, this is going to, in retrospect, we'll be looking at this as having certainly discredited the entire idea of having caucuses.
Now, on the race itself, the Democratic primary, what this does immediately, I think, is it denies anybody any sort of momentum coming out of Iowa. This is going to be harmful to whoever it ends up winning the caucus, because you won't really be able to say, on to New Hampshire, we're the victors in Iowa. Nobody really understands what's happening. No one's really going to care.
Yeah, well, you saw a lot of people last night give Pete Buttigieg a bunch of crap online because with zero real results reported, he gave this triumphant speech to all of his followers, be like, we're going to claim victorious and move on.
Yeah, look, if it's legit, then hey, but it's probably not.
But it still won't matter because nobody got it won't matter as much, I should say, because nobody got the Tuesday headlines all across the country. X candidate wins Iowa.
That's right.
Instead, the headlines maybe tomorrow on Wednesday are going to be X candidate won Iowa, maybe
wins after Iowa chaos. There's something like that just makes it that, and that's right. And then that means that New Hampshire is going to give us our first meaningful look at the presidential primary. So
the one thing that came out of last night that I thought was interesting that I'd also seen in the run-up in the week or so before, there are a lot of arguments being made about electability and electability and the ability to defeat Trump. Who's the best candidate to defeat Trump? And the news coverage I watched last night on CNN and MSNBC, that kept coming up a lot when they were interviewing caucus goers as a primary motivation. In the week or two before, you saw a lot of television ads. Well, I happened to watch an Iowa State basketball game on cable and a week or so ago, and everybody was advertising there, obviously. And a lot of the arguments from Warren and Biden were about electability. If that is something that carries over into other states and the rest of the primary, that's not good for Bernie Sanders.
Well, no, I mean, it's not. Bernie Sanders is running a very different kind of campaign from the, incremental reform stability argument that's being made, certainly by Biden. Warren is a little bit more ambitious. She kind of hits that sweet spot between the desire for, large systemic change and not going too far radical.
Making sure we can win, right.
That's right. And ultimately, I think that could be a really persuasive argument in some other states. I think that Sanders was hoping to do very well in Iowa just based on the momentum that he had built in the last week or so. And to the extent that the results there are kind of muted, it's not good for Sanders. That's right.
And it could be bad, too, depending on the outcome, in retrospect, for Pete Buttigieg and even for Amy Klobuchar, who were looking at being able to have a strong ground game in Iowa as a validator of their potential electability later on. And if the results don't bear that out, that's going to be hard for them, although that would have been the case anyway.
Yeah, I mean, Buttigieg's biggest challenge is to prove that he has actually got the chops to compete down the stretch, to be an electable candidate in a general election. I don't know that he's demonstrated that. I think that here again, an unambiguously strong showing in Iowa would have been good for him. And if the numbers still come out that he outperformed in Iowa, that success is muted by the chaos of the process. So
the other Colorado angle to this is what this does for the 2020 Senate race, particularly among Democrats. Andrew Romanoff is one of the Democrats who will be trying to get on the ballot through the caucus system, through the state assembly system. the front runner in the Democratic side, John Hickenlooper, is petitioning and going through that process at this point. That could change his mind. This, I think, is very harmful for Romanoff because even if he runs up somehow a big victory, or any other Democrat, frankly, in the state assembly process, it's not going to matter as much because people distrust the whole process because of what happened in Iowa.
Well, that's absolutely right. And I mean, even notwithstanding that, it's a fact that the graveyard of Colorado political history is full of guys who won the state assembly. Okay, I mean
that's true. Right.
I mean, Romanoff himself won the state assembly in 2010 against Bennett and went on to lose handily.
Mike Miles won in the Senate race in 2014 or 2004, I should say, against Ken Salazar.
That's right.
Ken Salazar went on to a huge victory. It wasn't a representative judgment of really how the primary was going to go anyway, but it's even less important now in the wake of Iowa.
It may even be a reasonable argument that given the unrepresentative results of the caucus and assembly process relative to that of the primary election that's ultimately decisive, that it does more harm than good.
Once again, we welcome back State Representative, House Majority Leader Alec Garnett to the Get More Smarter podcast. And a shout out to those of you also listening to the Smart Alec podcast. Representative Garnett, how's everything going down there?
Fellas, it's always an honor to be on. I'm excited to be on this week. Everything's great at the Capitol. We're here. We thought there was going to be a big snowmageddon, but I'm looking out my window and it looks pretty clear.
But you did have a delay, right, today?
We did have a delay. Yep, both the House and the Senate had a delay start, which helps people, be safe as they get to the Capitol.
It's a big difference in the roads between 8 a.m. and 11 a.m. It's true.
Yeah.
Who gets to decide that, or not gets to? How is that decided?
The majority leaders get to decide. So to be completely honest with you, it's some of the most stressful last year in particular. It's some of the most stressful decisions I make because it's only me making the call and it impacts aides and all the nonpartisan staff. And you want to make sure that you go home when it's dangerous, but that you don't spend too much time away because there's a lot of work that has to get done. And, so, the majority leaders make that call.
Yeah.
Like last year, the House stayed home, but the Senate had a full go through snowmageddon, which I like to joke around with Majority Leader Fenberg and Senate President Garcia was not
well received.
It was not well received. And I think they ran some like the biggest bills through committee that day.
Now, of course, it was not set up in advance that was going to be the bill debated.
Correct.
Just to keep that one particular little piece of rumor control intact here. But no, that's right. Making sure that people can safely get down to the Capitol, including all the witnesses and all the staff. That's very important.
And
it's the people's house.
And Alec Garnett controls the weather.
That's what I heard.
That's what you take away from this.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. God, that would be a great power of the majority leader. You get paid $42,000. You get a parking spot at the Capitol, and you get to control the weather if you're the majority leader.
It's awesome.
I think you get paid more if you control the weather. And we've been talking all day about the Iowa caucus problems. Debacle. Colorado switched to a primary after the last presidential election. It's something you're very familiar with. Tell us why we did that, and also thank God we did, but why that happened and what the rationale was there.
Yeah, so rewind to the first Tuesday of March 2016. It was pretty cold out. I have like 6 or 7 caucus locations in my district. I made it to 6 of them. And I just remember every time I showed up, I just saw volume. Either long lines wrapping around middle schools. Byers Middle School was a caucus location in the heart of Capitol Hill, and the line wrapped around the caucus location 3 times. And so I went to the end of the line and I was talking with people who were concerned about whether or not they were going to be able to check in by 7 o'clock and if they were going to be able to participate. There were other caucus locations in Denver where people had to move out of auditoriums and into parking lots, which obviously seems insane on a cold March night.
You should have made it warmer, by the way.
I could have made it warmer, yeah. I actually kept it kind of cold so that we could have this discussion about whether or not we should have caucuses.
That was well thought out.
But then, I talked to a bunch of people who were at the coffee shop that I go and get coffee at. And I remember I picked up food 2 nights after caucus, and I always check in to see if people participated. And a lot of people who either had childcare issues or who were working in the evenings don't get to participate in caucus. It's really hard to participate in caucus because you have to actually show up. We're in an era of making voting and participation in our republic easier. And so I went home that night and I tweeted, "We need a presidential primary." And the next morning, there was sort of a bipartisan group of us, Tim Dorr and now Senator Moreno and I, sat around thinking through how do we get to a place where we can have a presidential primary so everyone's voice is heard. And we eventually got there. And so we will have a presidential primary on Super Tuesday, which is March 3rd of this year, based on how terrible everyone's experience was in 2016.
And we're only doing that in the presidential race. Do you think that's something that we will switch eventually for major state races like U.S. Senate, or do we still need to have a caucus system for those smaller races?
It's such a good question. I don't know the answer to it. I know we kept it because we wanted to respect what the caucuses represent, right? So take Andrew Romanoff, for example. Andrew Romanoff is a U.S. Senate candidate. He has run in a couple primaries before. A lot of people in the party who are members of the party, who are part of county parties, who are activists know Andrew Romanoff really, really well. The caucus process rewards Andrew for the number of people within the party that really respect, love, and want to support Andrew. And so delegates will be chosen at each level of the process until you get to the state assembly in April, I think. And if Andrew gets over 30% of the delegate vote in April, then he will get on the primary ballot, which we have 2 primaries. So it does get a little confusing. So we have 2 primaries. The second primary is at the end of June for every other candidate. And in a way, the caucus process rewards Andrew for all of the time that he has spent with the party and getting to know the members of the Democratic Party. If you were to take out the caucus process and take out the assembly, which a lot of people are talking about doing for all the reasons we just mentioned, then Andrew would have to petition on along with every other candidate, and then that gets kind of expensive because the petition threshold's pretty high, and you have to pay circulators to go out and collect signatures.
Right. And
so it's a disadvantage to the people who really have gotten to know people in the party.
But of course, then
that
it gives more an advantage to those people than it does the people who, and to the regular voters who are not paying a lot of attention and not coming to these things, but still vote in every primary, whether they're Democrats or unaffiliated. They're a little bit removed from this process. So there's that side of the argument too. It is something I don't know how we fix going forward, but I imagine what happened in Iowa is going to give people some new ideas about that.
I think that's right. I think we eventually get to a place where the caucus and the assembly, we're kind of on this 20-year descent of party power. The party is kind of becoming less and less, and I can say this because I was kind of part of the party infrastructure for a long time. It's getting less and less influential. And so we are going to get to a place where I think right now we have bookends of primaries, right? You have the presidential primary on one end of the spectrum, and then the third Tuesday in June is the primary for everybody else. And in between that, you have caucus, assembly, and I think over time that process will be eliminated and you'll just have the 2 primaries. I don't think you can combine the 2. Well, at the moment, you can't combine the two because it creates a lot of pressure on people who are maybe serving in the legislature or who don't have enough time between the last general election and the upcoming primary to get all the work done to get onto the ballot.
Right.
So I would imagine that we still keep that June primary for everybody else, even though the presidential primaries moved up.
Let's talk about some legislation now. One of the things that happened just recently, we talked about it last week, the puppy mill bill has gone the way of the dodo. What happened there? How did that bill end up dying?
So Monica Duran, as a state representative from Jefferson County, she worked really hard as a sponsor, really understands the issue very well. She tried to offer an amendment last night to get people to a place where they were a little bit more comfortable. The introduced bill was what I would call a pretty extreme bill in terms of other legislation that we've seen in the past, in terms of how it outlaws, it prohibits puppies or pet stores from selling puppies or kittens, and really kind of cracks down on that business relationship, which, in Colorado, we have a lot of breeders. We have a pretty robust ag community that relies on, and ranching community that relies on a lot of dogs that are bred. And so what we saw is last night, a ton of people come and testify. I think there was upwards of 6 hours of testimony from people across the state who came and discussed why they did and didn't like the bill, but I think there was more in opposition than in support. And I think at the end, members on both sides of the aisle thought that there needed to be some more stakeholding between all the people who care about this issue before they felt comfortable moving forward, even with the amended version. So it didn't make it out of committee, but again, I talked about last week how I tried to work on a bill and I never got to the point of introduction. So Monica, took a step further than I ever got to. She introduced a bill. She had a robust hearing. She almost got it out. It lost by one vote. And so I think in the future, the conversation will continue. And I recommended to her maybe splitting the bill up into kind of smaller pieces to go one step at a time so that it doesn't feel like it's such a big change to the process.
What's going on in terms of what has been thus far one of the bigger, or probably the biggest headline bill of the year, repealing the death penalty? Where are we at on that?
So we were talking last week as they were, we kind of predicted that they might be bringing it up in the Senate at the end of last week, and that's what they did. The Senate debated the repeal of the death penalty on the floor on Thursday for 6 hours. A lot of amendments were run. There was a lot of passionate testimony. I have so much respect for Senator Rhonda Fields, who there are 3 people who are currently on death row. 2 of them are responsible for murdering her son and her future daughter-in-law. And so she is very passionate about this issue, and she was so eloquent on the floor, and I think did an amazing job of representing the victim's point of view in the Senate chamber. The bill eventually got passed the Senate on Friday on third reading. It was with bipartisan support. 3 Republicans supported the bill. We kind of talked through how different it was this year because there were Republicans who we thought might support it, and 3 of them ended up voting for it. Jack Tate, Owen Hill, and Kevin Priola. And so the bill had 19 votes in the Senate. And so it came over to the House. We're still right now we're in the middle of supplemental week, which isn't that sexy, but we go through and true up all the executive department's budgets. So that takes an entire week for us to do that. So a lot of our work is sort of set aside, but we'll get to scheduling and making our way through the repeal of the death penalty here shortly.
Now, Representative Dave Williams, a Republican from Colorado Springs, has threatened to shut down the House over the death penalty repeal bill. Is there any way he can do that?
So I would have been talked to Dave about those comments. He seemed to hint that they were kind of taken out of context a little bit. He was frustrated that the Senate was ruling amendments that were coming forward out of order, and he was frustrated about that. So one, it's no, you can't really shut down the process. There are ways to avoid that happening. We hope we don't get to that point. Again, there's that saying that we talked about a few weeks ago: the majority gets their way, the minority gets their say. So Representative Williams has every right to talk as long as he wants on whether or not we should or should not repeal the death penalty. And we want to be very respectful of his rights as a member. I think his frustration that amendments were being ruled out of order, it was primarily, essentially what happens is if you run an amendment that doesn't fit under the title of the bill. So say the title of the bill is 14-year-olds should be able to drive, or increase age or decrease age of driving in Colorado to 14. Okay. Maybe that was the title of the bill. If you ran an amendment to say we shouldn't, the age of a driver should be decreased from 16 to 15, but not all the way down to 14. Well, that doesn't fit inside the title of the bill because the bill has to do only with reducing age of driving to 14. And if you run an amendment that doesn't fit under the title of the bill, then it gets ruled out of order because technically we shouldn't be taking votes or trying to amend a bill that doesn't fit under the title of the bill. So that was what was happening in the Senate. And so we'll see what happens over here, and we'll be as respectful as we can about amendments that are coming forward, and we'll just go one step at a time.
I mean, isn't it true, though, that the House rules are less conducive to meaningful obstruction than those of the Senate?
Yeah, there are slight differences for sure in both chambers' rules. It is, in terms of amendments, and weird things called COW amendments, Committee of the Whole amendments. We have a much more strict policy in the House than they do in the Senate.
Okay.
The 2019 legislative session was the first one with Democrats holding a trifecta for a long time, where they had control of the House, control of the Senate, and control of the governor's office. We saw a lot of Republican obstruction last year, partially probably, because of some of their frustration with not knowing what to do for in terms of advancing their own ideas when they have such a minority. Are you seeing the same kind of obstruction this year? Are they going about their business a different way?
So like most sessions, it's started off pretty slow. I think it's hard to tell yet the level of obstruction that may come on some of the bigger issues. So at the moment, everything's going great. Both sides are talking a lot, and there's a lot of communication. That could change as early as tomorrow as we start to debate the supplementals. I think there's some things in there that members on the other side of the aisle aren't in support of. And so we could have a fierce debate on the floor as early as tomorrow. So really at any point, things can start to get more heated and slow down a little bit. And I don't know if it will get to the point of the level of obstruction last year where both the governor got sued and the Senate president got sued over kind of things that happened in each chamber. And that was a pretty extraordinary escalation of the obstruction. Yeah. So I don't think it's going to get to, I would hope that it doesn't get to that place.
Well, and particularly since it didn't end up doing much for them. I can't imagine Republicans trying that again.
Well, again, that was all supposed to be a political lead up to the accountability of recalls, and
that didn't work.
That's true. Yeah. I think, if I played in the MLB, I'd probably have a better batting average than they did with those recalls.
Yeah.
There's a couple of other bills that I think are interesting that are coming up soon. One of them, Senate Bill 123, compensation for student athletes. This is part of a national discussion about whether college athletes should be getting paid for their likenesses, for their endorsements, that kind of thing. Do you think this has a significant chance of getting through the legislature, or is this going to get bogged down?
I think it has a great chance of making it through the legislature. It's a really important issue to a lot of people in the legislature, especially members of our Black Caucus, who are really taking the lead on sponsorship this year. In the House, it's Representative James Coleman and Representative Leslie Herod, and in the Senate, Senator Rhonda Fields is taking the lead. This is an important issue to make sure that people who play in these sports that make the NCAA and individual universities so much money, that they get an opportunity to benefit from that. Rick George, who's the athletic director for the University of Colorado, sits on the NCAA's committee that's looking at this issue in particular. The only reason that the NCAA even set up a committee is because California passed a bill last year. I think 19 other states are currently looking at passing similar legislation this year. So, what often happens when you're trying to create change is that legislative bodies start pushing, and then, whoever they're trying to impact reacts, and that's what this committee is. It's a reaction of state legislatures taking the lead. But Rick George came out, I think, last week and said that he's in support of the draft legislation that he's seen from the sponsors. I get a little hesitant that if Rick George is in support, that means we're actually creating enough change. I can't imagine the NCAA is just going to go along with it. So at the moment, it looks like at least the draft legislation they're looking at has a good chance of making it through. I guess my question then is it strong enough to truly impact student athletes' lives? And that's what I'll be looking at when I take a look at the bill.
And as a former NBA star yourself, I mean, this is really personal for you.
Yeah, well, that was actually my cousin, Kevin Garnett, who was that NBA star.
Oh,
but a lot of people still call.
Well, I just figured that everybody who was 7.5 feet taller or taller like you are, sir, would obviously have played in the NBA.
Well, listen, I have, one of my most special possessions in my office is a plaque that I'm looking at right now that says tallest legislator. It was given to me by two of my very, very good friends. It hangs prominently in the office, and it's the thing I'm most proud of. So,
it's fantastic.
It's one thing to be a tall NBA player. It's another thing to be the tallest legislator
ever.
Right. That's right.
Yeah,
that's right.
Ever.
Yeah. What about any other legislation or things down at the Capitol that you're really keeping more of an eye on, like an extra eye on this week?
It looks like there's a lot of movement going on with family medical leave. The sponsors, Senator Winter and Representative Gray, Senator Williams and Representative Monica Duran, have started putting pen to paper, and they're having a lot of negotiations with stakeholders and with individual legislators about what form family medical leave will take here in Colorado, which is great. We're seeing a lot of progress there, which is I think you will be able to determine the success of the 2020 session by whether or not family medical leave gets to the finish line. So the fact that they are, I think, us monitoring that is something that I'm always watching. I'm always checking in with them. It looks like they continue to have meetings. They're working on a draft bill, and we should see that, I think, relatively soon. So that's really exciting, and that's something that we're all watching very closely.
Do you think we're going to end up with more of a private funded system or more of a public funded system? And because that's been the big debate on that.
Yeah, I think, so I would call it like a hybrid. So for example, I just got nailed with a huge medical bill yesterday. And so even though I have insurance through my wife's employer, I still interact with the insurance company, right? So the insurance company can still deny the things that I think they should cover. They can still not cover things totally that I thought they were going to cover partially. So I'm interacting with the insurance company, even though I get insurance from my employer. This would be a lot different. What this would say is every employer must offer this benefit, and the details aren't finalized yet, but let's just say 10 weeks of leave for all of these different things. If your mother gets sick, if your father gets sick, if your wife has a baby, if your wife gets sick. So there are all these things that the policy must cover. And so your employer must give you that much time to take off and have a progressive pay wage while you're off. And then the employer has a choice. They can just offer that to you and pay you your progressive wage and not have any insurance whatsoever, but they have to give that to you. Or they can choose to buy a policy in the private marketplace that covers them for giving you that leave. And it's totally up to them. But as the employee, you know that you're going to get that full benefit no matter what. And it's up to the employer to figure out how they're going to pay for it. So it's a very different relationship than the one I just described, where I get insurance through my employer, but I'm still interacting with the insurance company. Every employee in Colorado under this hybrid model that they're talking about will get the benefit. How it's paid for is going to be up to the employer.
That sounds like frankly, it sounds like a great compromise.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we're all going to have to take a look as it gets finalized, but I commend the sponsors for all the hard work that they put into this. And again, the goal has always been to create something that fits into Colorado's economy and workplace, and that it really is a Colorado solution. And it seems to me they're really close to getting to that point.
Well, I really hope you guys are able to get this through. I know that this has been subject of a lot of man hours of work in the last 2 years. So.
Agreed.
Well, House Majority Leader Garnett, thank you so much once again for giving us your insights and some expertise about what's going on down at the state capitol. We'll talk to you next week, hopefully, and hopefully you won't have to worry about any more snow days.
Yeah, thanks, fellas. Don't worry, I control the weather. No more snow. So if you like skiing, too bad for you. We have legislation that we have to get through.
Oh, thank God. All right, sir.
All right,
Take care.
See you guys.
Let's move on to what has been the top story for weeks and may finally be something we're going to not talk about as much going forward: impeachment. On Monday, we heard some very strong arguments, closing arguments on the case for impeachment from Representative Adam Schiff of California and Colorado's own Representative Jason Crow, Democrat from Aurora. Take a listen to what Crow had to say.
I submit to you on behalf of the House of Representatives that your duty demands that you convict President Trump. Now, I don't pretend that this is an easy process. It's not designed to be easy. It shouldn't be easy to impeach or convict a president. Impeachment is an extraordinary remedy, a tool only to be used in rare instances of grave misconduct. But it is in the Constitution for a reason. In America, no one is above the law, even those elected President of the United States. And I would say, especially those elected President of the United States.
Really, really well thought out, well delivered. He did a good job with some dramatic pauses there. It's not going to matter, sadly.
Well, no, but I mean, he really distinguished himself well. Very few Americans are actually watching or listening to the entire impeachment process. The hearings are very long. A lot of the subject matter is repetitive. What they're seeing on the evening news are some of these highlight speeches. And Representative Crow was really, really good in being able to make a cogent argument that can be related in the limited time span of a newscast. Really impressed with him. I think that this was a capability or a talent of his that folks always suspected was there, but was never really demonstrated before this.
There's been a lot of hand-wringing among Democrats and people who don't like Trump, who are concerned about how Senate Republicans handled this process and are essentially getting ready to exonerate Trump. We won't know for sure until Wednesday what the vote is going to be, but nobody really thinks it's going to be anything but letting Trump off the hook. But I think that's important to keep that perspective in mind. This is what everybody knew was going to happen. The House was going to impeach Trump. The Senate was going to brush it under the rug.
Yeah. And here's the thing. It got much, much harder for Republicans to maintain that as the process went along. At no point did we ever get exonerating information about the president. What we actually got through the impeachment process was successively more and more damning evidence that everything that the Democrats had alleged about this was true.
One of the things I think, along those lines of not being able to show that Trump was really exonerated, you have Senator Lamar Alexander of Tennessee, who was considered really the key vote at one point on whether or not witnesses were going to be called. Ultimately, he couldn't find the courage to do that. But he did say that Trump's conduct did not rise to the level of impeachable, but he conceded that Democrats had proven their case that Trump used his office to press a foreign country to announce investigations that could help him politically. So we're likely not going to get an impeachment, but we do have a lot of Republicans saying, yeah, pretty close.
Yeah. And that differs obviously from the line from the White House and from Trump's impeachment defense lawyers that Trump did absolutely nothing wrong. It's not possible to maintain the line that Trump did absolutely nothing wrong in the face of anybody who knows the facts of the case. And it's necessary for them to fall back to, well, okay, this wasn't great. Cory Gardner once used that infamous line about how no one will win any merit badges, which is what he said about the Russia investigation. Right. Yeah. But, it doesn't rise to the level where we would actually remove a president. It's interesting because everybody who stays with the president did absolutely nothing wrong, like Ken Buck and some others that we've heard from here in Colorado, that's not a credible position, and it's not going to age well. The people who are in the middle, who say, oh, well, Trump may have done some things wrong, but this doesn't rise to the level of impeachment, are more defensible with rational, audiences, but that just outrages the Republican base.
I'm sort of surprised they didn't stick with that argument from the beginning, though.
Well,
it was really always the only place they could go.
That was not acceptable to Trump, and these guys are all being watched like a hawk by Donald Trump personally, who has the ability, with no one interceding to tell him what's better for the party or anything, to just trash his own whenever they do something that he doesn't like.
And remember that the American public is not on board with what Senate Republicans have done. 75% of Americans in a Quinnipiac University poll said that they wanted to see witnesses called. That did not happen. A NBC News Wall Street Journal poll that came out over the weekend showed 52% of Americans believed Trump abused his power. 53% believed that he obstructed Congress.
Right.
They're more divided on whether or not Trump should be removed from office. But the bottom line here is that anybody who's looking at this with any sort of open eye to it sees that this was clearly a problem. And the least you can, really, when you say this didn't rise to an impeachable offense, that's the best you got. Overall, this did not go well for Republicans.
Oh, no. And when you consider that some of the same Republicans who are now saying that this does not rise to the level of an impeachable offense voted to convict Clinton in the 1999 impeachment trial over what is universally considered to be a much less serious matter. The hypocrisy of that is just unsustainable, and voters are going to have a real problem with it when they get to pass their own judgment in November.
And this is going to get worse for Trump, for Senate Republicans. We saw last week a Washington Post story involving Cory Gardner that he and several Republican senators were in committee hearings in 2015, 2016, as far back as 2014, where they were briefed on United States policy toward Ukraine and briefed on the idea that what Biden was doing in asking the prosecutor general in Ukraine to be removed was, in fact, U.S. foreign policy. So these things, more of this is going to come out, more of this is going to become clear in the coming weeks and months, and it's going to be harder and harder to defend. And in fact, I think we've seen a preview of this already. The hashtag #CoverUpCory went national last week.
Yeah, that one is becoming, it rolls off the tongue well, and it happens to be true.
It does.
So, Cory is clearly as tightly coordinated with the White House and the impeachment defense strategy as McConnell always freely admitted that he was. The only difference is that Cory Gardner lied about it. I mean, he told everybody who would listen that he was hearing the evidence, that he was going to be impartial about it. He said it yesterday again, and nobody believes it.
Right. Here's Cory Gardner's quote to CNN when asked about whether or not Trump's conduct was appropriate. Quote, "We're still in the middle of this trial." Cool.
I mean, it's like, come on.
And then he says, quote, "We still have tomorrow to deliberate and consider. I made my comments about witnesses, and I'm not going to go on screen now that I think we're in the middle of an important process."
He's really afraid of being on camera at this point, isn't he? I'll tell you that video of him with the gilded elevator doors closing
right.
on all the reporters that were trying to get an answer to a simple question, that got in his head, didn't it?
Well, I think, as we talked about last week, I think Gardner has finally realized that this didn't work for him.
Yeah.
Dodging and avoiding all these questions, particularly when other senators are saying things. You've got Lamar Alexander, you've got Lisa Murkowski of Alaska saying that, yeah, it doesn't look like Trump did. It looks like what Trump did was wrong.
Right.
Maybe not impeachable. And Gardner says nothing. He's been getting drilled by local reporters. The Aurora Sentinel, in an editorial on January 31st, called this Republican cowardly collusion.
Mm-hmm.
This is going to be tough. I would say nigh impossible for Cory to just sort of sweep under the rug heading into the November reelection.
Frankly, nobody in the media is going to even be able to admit how bad this is until the November election, because that'll be the point when we see all the damage that this has wrought. But, there was another poll that came out this week, Republican pollster, that's just predicting another bloodbath for Republicans in Colorado in the 2020 elections, following up the Democratic wave in 2018. And I think that's real plausible. I think actually they are not done paying for Trump, but also for the out-of-touch local Republicans that they embarked on all those crazy recalls. They become the face of just ridiculous social policy like anti-vaxxerism and, just a round of scurrilously anti-LGBT bills. We'll get to all of that here, but
you mentioned Ken Buck, the congressman from Greeley, who moonlights as the Colorado Republican Party chairman, or vice versa.
And that's the opinion of most Colorado
right.
Republicans who have entertained the idea of getting him out of office early. I don't know if they're going to succeed.
So what did Buck say on Fox Business?
Okay, all right. No, this is good stuff, because yesterday, Joni Ernst, senator from Iowa, in responding on questions about impeachment, claimed that Democrats had created an environment where Joe Biden could potentially be impeached immediately after his election. If that were to occur, based on this supposition that, every president has committed impeachable offenses, which is silly, of course, and not supported by the evidence. But that's a contention. That's also the contention that Ken Buck has made, of course, that any president duly scrutinized would be found to have committed impeachable offenses on the same scale.
Well, Buck's not even saying wait until Biden's elected.
Well, no, that's the thing. Yeah, he's like, let's go ahead and impeach him now.
Here's what he said on Fox Business. Quote, "Well, I would say this. There's no reason to wait for the election. Vice President Biden could be impeached now." Why? Impeached? What do you mean impeached?
Technically, you can impeach somebody who served in office.
Right.
Back in the day, obviously Biden's been out of office since 2015, but he could be hypothetically impeached by the Democratic-controlled U.S. House, and
right.
they would do that because they want to help Republicans
and again, even though
political attack on a Democratic presidential candidate. It's stupid.
And even though there's this history of legislative hearings that some people like Gardner were in that proved already that Biden was just conducting U.S. foreign policy.
Right.
But
like you say, Cory Gardner's known this since 2014. It's silly, all right? And it's all just a bunch of distractions been thrown up to try to divert from the truth of all this, which is what Trump actually did. as opposed to all of these hypotheticals and allegations for which no evidence has ever been presented.
Ernst notably walked this back later.
Yeah, by the next day, she's like, oh, no, we're not actually going to try to impeach Biden. I mean, come on now. But Ken Buck, he has a reputation for, and there's no nice way to say this,
idiocy,
saying stupid shit. He has actually been pretty useful to Democrats in this long history of investigations against Trump. He helped lead former special prosecutor Robert Mueller right into stating on the record that, oh, yeah, Trump could get indicted after he leaves office, which was just thanks very much for that, say the Democrats. And then, of course, Ken Buck, disparaging all of the House impeachment hearings.
Not bothering to show up for a lot of them.
He should have just come to. He's like, oh, these closed-door hearings. It's like they weren't closed-door.
The ones that I'm invited to.
I mean, he's repeatedly failed to make his fellow Republicans look good. And that's a process that obviously continues.
Where this story sort of heads now, and you're seeing a lot of commentary from a lot of national columnists, is the idea of, will this restrain Trump, the fact that he almost got impeached, or is this going to just make him worse in terms of, I don't know, that's not even a question, right?
Honestly, I think that he is going to go so far over the top after the vote by his Republican allies to acquit that he's probably going to do significant continuing political damage to himself and to every Republican who has to run with him on the 2020 ticket.
Here's Jonathan Swan from Axios. Quote, everything we've heard from Trump's aides over the last month suggests he will give less and less credence to voices urging caution. Per a senior White House official, Trump feels every major gamble he's taken has succeeded, despite advisors who were chicken littles. So Trump looks at everything in the most Trump-friendly way possible. So to him, he was completely exonerated.
This could actually make way for a scary few months in American history. And in the event that Trump is decisively defeated, let alone narrowly defeated, God help us, the possibility of him being reticent to accept the results of an election. I mean, these are all things that are unfortunately
and even if he
concerns.
Even if he loses in November, he's got that 6 weeks where he's a lame duck. God knows what he could do then.
Oh man, no, I don't really. I think that given the way that Trump has conducted himself through this presidency, which is bull in a china shop, it's just kind of scary to think about what could actually happen here as his power comes to an end.
I know it's easy to criticize the president for when he spends millions and millions of federal dollars going to his own.
What about his shit? Don't even.
Just let me finish.
Okay.
Going to his own Gulf resorts, going to Mar-a-Lago in Florida, and it cost taxpayers millions of dollars, and he ragged on Obama going golfing. That being said, I would much rather him spend his time going golfing and like goofing around and
Fair
tweeting
point.
than actually doing anything or exercising his
Golf
power.
more, govern less.
This speaks to the theory that Trump is self-limiting due to incompetence. And no, there's an argument for that. Yeah, and frankly, I think that the country has relied upon that for its survival for at least several points during this administration.
Oh yeah.
Now, at the end of the week last week, we finally saw some fundraising numbers for the fourth quarter, end of the year 2019. The federal finance reports weren't due until January 31st. Senator Cory Gardner and Democrat Andrew Romanoff both waited really almost until the last minute to release their numbers. And we learned quite a bit from both of those filings.
Well, in fact, we did. We discovered, and this is actually a very significant development, that
let's start with Gardner. Yeah.
Hickenlooper John Hickenlooper, the presumptive Democratic nominee in the Democratic U.S. Senate primary, he handily outraised Cory Gardner.
40% more.
Which is really unexpected. Of course, Cory Gardner retains some advantage in terms of cash on hand, but the trajectory there is really, really ominous. I mean, this is a guy who's never had a problem raising money.
Gardner barely passed $2 million raised in the fourth quarter. The only way he got there was through about $400,000 in committee transfers.
Yeah,
right.
yeah. And Hickenlooper, I mean, he probably will have some transfers at some point, but he didn't have any in this quarter. That was all fundraising. And
you compare that to somebody like Republican Senator Martha McSally of Arizona, who doubled what Gardner raised in the fourth quarter. What that indicates to me, and I think to a lot of other people, is Republican donors may be looking at Gardner and saying, you're not savable.
There is a possibility that Cory Gardner is going to get, as they call it, triaged out of the group of Republican senators that are considered defensible in the election. That happens with several identifiable cues, to include the cancellation of ad buys, the withdrawal of national staff, reduction of social media activity by the NRSC and other major players of that kind.
And another metric
everything we're watching for all of that now that his fundraising is in decline.
Another metric that makes a difference here is the perceived competitiveness of a Democratic primary. A tough, nasty Democratic primary obviously benefits Gardner. What we saw in the latest campaign finance reports, though, Andrew Romanoff, really the only legitimate, even if you can call him that, contender for the Democratic nomination, out not named Hickenlooper, raised about $313,000 in the fourth quarter.
I mean, that's a tiny fraction of what Hickenlooper raised. It's a tiny fraction of what Cory Gardner raised. For all of the rhetoric in the Democratic U.S. Senate primary, the results of this fundraising quarter really were anticlimactic.
Romanoff spent $352,000 in Q4. So he raised $40,000 less than he's spending. That is obviously, I'm no math major, but that's not a sustainable burn rate.
By every hard metric that we use to evaluate the viability of a campaign, Romanoff has not met it, and he's not making enough money to effectively compete in the primary, let alone provide hope that he will be an effective competitor to Cory Gardner in the fall. This is not a judgment that's made based on any particular bias.
It is what it is.
It's made based on performance of the candidate. That's right. And at this point, Romanoff's rhetoric, which has been, in the vernacular, scorched earth, with regard to his principal primary opponent, he needs to reevaluate what that is going to mean in the long-term scope of the Senate race and what it'll mean for his reputation following the primary.
In short, Romanoff, at this rate, cannot conceivably win a Democratic primary. The only question is, to what extent can he damage the eventual winner?
That's the unfortunate fact of the matter. And, in terms of the actual outcome of the primary, I don't think that has been in question since Hickenlooper entered the race. But you could have still made an argument for Romanoff. Well, no, that's right.
Ago.
But when Romanoff's fundraising precipitously declined from Q3 to Q4, that's a very clear indicator that this is not a viable challenge.
And when he's spending more than he's raising.
Yeah.
I mean, that's...
to the extent that Romanoff is making ideological appeals to the Democratic base, those may have traction disproportionate to the financial cost of them, but it is ultimately destructive to the Democrats. It is overall destructive to the Democrats' longer-term goal of unseating Cory Gardner.
The good news potentially, though, if you're somebody who supports John Hickenlooper and we're worried about the harm Andrew Romanoff could cause, his inability to raise money is going to make it very tough for him to reach people who are not the active Democrats who show up at caucus meetings and show up at House district meetings. The regular Democratic unaffiliated voter who is not that plugged in they're not going to hear from Romanoff.
The fact is that the Colorado U.S. Senate race is expected to be one of the very most competitive, if not the most competitive in the country. Tens of millions of dollars are going to be invested into this race, and any candidate who believes that they are going to be a serious challenger has to be able to show the fundraising and organizational capacity to compete. And I'm afraid that just hasn't happened here.
No, and this is a fundraising number, 313,000. That's on par. That'd be a decent number if you're running for a seat in the House of Representatives.
Yes, I mean, it's quite good for a congressional race, but I mean, it's just not going to get it done. And here again, when it is so lopsided that it gives people outside of the state, national funders, national players, absolutely no reason to even consider this a competitive primary whatsoever, then it's trying to reevaluate what you're doing.
The other thing we learned from these campaign finance filings is that incumbent Representative Scott Tipton of Congressional District 3, which is Western Colorado, Southern Colorado, Northern Colorado, it's sort of like if you drew a C around the state.
Yeah.
He raised $182,000 in the last quarter, which is not very good.
It's a soft fundraising quarter for any congressional candidate, even in a nominally competitive race. This race is Scott Tipton, as we know, has won re-election since 2010 by respectable margins. However, he has always had some amount of discontent on the hard right. This year, he faces an energetic primary challenge from Lauren Boebert,
better known as Yosemite
Samantha. We say that affectionately because she's always armed, and I wouldn't want to piss her off.
Right.
Yeah. Well, I mean, hell.
Fair.
In any event, her fundraising quarter wasn't so great. She didn't quite get to 30,000, but
she only had a few weeks.
Tipton's right. That's right. She was only in the race for a few weeks, and Tipton's fundraising was sufficiently weak that you can't quite rule her out of the race yet. And the other part of this is that Tipton was outraised considerably.
James Iacina, one of the two Democrats running in this seat, reported raising nearly $300,000 in the fourth quarter. So, not quite double what Tipton raised.
It's a big deal, and he didn't even. I mean, he's a wealthy guy, but very little of that was actually money that he self-funded. He actually got out there and raised some money. It's really impressive. I mean, there's going to be a primary on the Democratic side in CD3. There's a candidate
Diane
there,
Mitch-Bush.
Mitch-Bush, former state representative. She's got a lot of respect out there. We got to see what happens here, because if Iacino turns into a very different kind of challenge, Scott Tipton could really be in trouble. And if Scott Tipton is perceived to be in trouble, it's an opening for Lauren Boebert.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and his low fundraising means that he's in danger of having to spend more money. Well, he's in danger of that anyway with the primary from Boebert. But if he has to spend a lot of his money in June, that's going to make it very hard for national Republicans to keep him on their protect list in the summer.
Yep.
As they're looking at it, where they can keep, they're not going to win back the House.
Right.
But they're going to, where do they stem the bleeding? This may be a place where they cut Tipton loose.
The name of the game for Republicans this year is triage, figuring out where they can defend seats and where they need to give them up and cut their losses. And I think Cory Gardner's in a lot more danger of that right now than Scott Tipton, but we'll see where this goes.
And finally, there's a story that you probably missed, but we wanted to draw some attention to that was in Politico a couple of days ago about the Department of Agriculture under Trump. This is really concerning to me.
Yeah.
We've seen before, we've talked about this in the past, that some of the offices of the USDA have been moved to the Kansas City area, largely because they're trying to sort of cut up these larger departments and try to get rid of them altogether, kind of like moving the BLM to Grand Junction, Colorado. But this political story talks about how the USDA is making decisions on things like, and remember, they do programs like food stamps and things like that, that they're not using any sort of data to inform what they're doing.
They don't want data. They want to enact an ideological agenda. In this case, the ideological agenda is that if poor people are hungry, they're more inclined to go to work and get money for themselves to eat. And if not, well, that's the part of the question that they'd rather not answer, because we're talking about human suffering and people not having enough to eat.
Right. Representative Shelley Pingree of Maine, and I probably just butchered that name. She's a member of the House Agricultural Committee. She said to Politico, quote, "They operate much more on anecdote and ideology than facts and data."
Yeah.
And this is, this goes back to for the last couple of years in the Trump administration. Last June, the department's internal watchdog launched an investigation into whether officials used flawed data to support a new rule that would allow meat packers to accelerate pork processing lines to higher speeds. Economists have challenged the USDA data on how it's structuring its trade bailout for farmers. I mean, this is very much just people making decisions based on whatever sort of political ideology they think that they come in predisposed to believe, and not even bothering to back up these decisions with data.
Yeah. Well, as Benjamin Franklin sagely observed hundreds of years ago, Americans tend to get the government that we deserve. And what we have is an elected president who came in with an ideology that purposefully disregards facts in favor of making sweeping changes that the ideology dictates. In that respect, it's not that much different from, people are going to love this analogy, Joseph Stalin, when he decided to collectivize agriculture in the Soviet Union in the 1930s. Didn't really care what the effect was on individual people as long as the larger ideological policy goal was achieved. And that's really scary way to do policy. It was bad when Stalin did it, and it's bad when the Trump administration judges things that have practical impacts on people's lives based on some sort of ideological supposition that's never been tested.
This is not just Democrats saying this. Republican Representative Dan Newhouse blasted a plan by Agriculture Secretary Sonny Perdue that would have shuttered some job training centers for at-risk youth. This is what he said in a committee hearing, quote, "It appears the administration's rollout of this proposal was done carelessly and without the data or the statistics to point to any rhyme or reason as to how the decisions were made." So this is, you've got people on both sides of the aisle saying the same thing, that there is no, irregardless of whether they agree with the decision, they're both saying there's no data to back it up. And that's a microcosm of the entire Trump administration. But this freaked me out a bit when I saw this story.
It's an old saying that Republicans are for budget cuts until you come for their sacred cow. And it's interesting to see that even Republicans are throwing up red flags, because this is really going to hurt people. It hurts people in red states. This sort of policy mismanagement has negative consequences that have no partisan distinction.
That does it for us in episode 28 of the Get More Smarter podcast. The Get More Smarter podcast is a production of ColoradoPolls.com and ProgressNow Colorado. Your hosts are Alan Franklin and me, Jason Bane. This time, Ethan Black engineers and produces our show. The phenomenal Breakmaster Cylinder made our dope theme music. We record weekly in the basement of the Alliance Center in what seems like very cold, frozen downtown Denver, Colorado. Subscribe on Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Send us an email at angryrants@getmoresmarter.com. We'll talk at you next week.